Thanks very much, Brecon. So recording has started. So welcome everyone to today's session on travel and transport. I'm joined today by my colleague Katrina Fallon from the Green Arts Initiative and Brecon Byron from Native Events. And my name is Noreen Lucy and I also work at Native Events. So just to recap on where we are on the Autumn Series training webinars, today we're covering travel and transport and we just have 3 more webinars to cover. Next week will be content programming and communications. On the 5th of November, we have a session dedicated to festivals that will be on energy. And then the last session for all art centres and strategically funded organisations will be on climate adaptation. Again, just a reminder on where all of the previous sessions, slides, presentations and resources are saved on the Arts Council's website. So I suppose the focus of today's session is, I suppose, to better understand our travel and transport impacts, and I suppose across various, inputs such as, staff travel, artist travel, crew travel, the travel and transport associated with, exhibition or production transport. What we will not cover today will be audience travel. That was included in last week's webinar, which is now available to be viewed on the link that we just provided also. So we'll take a look at the context in terms of the setting for travel and transport in a national, in an Irish context, and then also in an international context. And then we'll bring it back to the arts sector and the importance of travel within our sector. We'll take a look at travel and transport by activity and organisation type. We'll really focus in on touring and we'll use that as an example. As always, I suppose we'll highlight some of the challenges and obstacles when it comes to travel and transport, but then provide some solutions. We'll have some key tools in terms of measurement and some approaches that we can take and some examples of travel policies. And then, as always, we'll finish up with some case studies and resources. But before I hand you over to my colleague Katrina, we're going to launch a poll and we're going to hear from you. So we'd like you to take a look at this question. Which of the following travel and transport impacts apply to your organisation? Touring performers nationally, touring performers internationally, transporting sets and costumes nationally, transporting sets and costumes internationally, transporting artworks nationally and internationally, artist travel in terms of career development, both nationally and internationally, and then general business travel, and that is national and international also. So I can see the results are coming in there. We'll give it a minute before we launch the results. What we're seeing is in the lead there, let me see, is currently general business travel nationally, followed by internationally, and then also touring performers nationally. So there's a lot of results coming in there now. So yeah, it really is general business travel and touring performers nationally and internationally. So I think we have 88% have participated. So we can launch the results there and I'll hand you over to my colleague, Katrina. Thank you very much.
Thanks a million, Noreen, and good morning to everybody who's on the webinar with us today. This is probably one of the more tricky topics in a way that we've dealt with throughout these webinars, and part of that is the complexity of how we can green or make travel and transport more sustainable. There really aren't any easy solutions, but also because it holds a particular, I suppose, importance in the arts sector. Mobility is really seen as a kind of critical component of cultural life for artists, performers, audiences, technical and production crews, programmers, curators. So it's really key to how we work in the arts sector. Transporting sets and artworks is another significant element. And it's, I suppose in that sense, it's a kind of almost a bit like a sacred cow, because being able to show what we do and showcase what we do around the country, but also outside of the country, and bring in performers and events and activities from outside the country, we see that as being really critical to the cultural exchange we have. It enriches our life and it enriches the cultural life of other countries. So it's really vital to the whole cultural landscape and ecology and of the art sector. So it can be a very emotional issue if we look at the impacts that it has. And yet, the travel and transport really does contribute significantly to climate change. And decarbonising transport and travel, so that is removing the greenhouse gases from travel, is very challenging. The art sector obviously is a very small sector. It has a very small impact in total. And the transport element of that is obviously also very small. But every sector has to look at its impacts, and we have to look at the wider picture. So there is that real tension between wanting to do something to address our transport impacts, but also really recognising that travel, and particularly international travel, is so important to so many arts organisations. So we're going to look a little bit at the context internationally and nationally. Do this very briefly, but basically transport emissions are continuing to grow globally, even as modes of travel, the kinds of cars, the kinds of trains we use, or even the kind of planes we use, emissions have reduced per kilometre for those over the last decade. So they're becoming much more energy efficient. The improvements in technology alone are just not going to be enough to fix what we need to do. We need changes in behaviour. We need less air travel. We need more and better public transport and active travel. And that's generally, I'm not talking specifically about the arts sector. Air travel is an issue, a bigger issue, well outside the arts sector. That's just a very quick look at how transport emissions break down globally. A lot of road transport. International aviation is 6.3, and what you can see there is domestic aviation is, I think, about 5.5. So it's about 11% of the total emissions. But bearing in mind that there's, a large chunk of the world's population that never fly and will never fly. And how does that look in Ireland? Well, transport emissions in Ireland have kind of mirrored our emissions generally since 1990. So they rose significantly into the Celtic Tiger, fell a bit during the crash, rose with the recovery, fell during COVID, and have increased over the last number of years. So the trajectory at the moment is definitely up. And we would say that at the moment, the overall transport emissions represent about 21.4%. So it's a kind of stubborn percentage. It's a stubborn amount that doesn't seem to want to go down, that we can't really seem to grasp. And just interestingly, today, figures out from the EPA saying that for the first time ever, they've given a quarterly report. So the first 3 months of this year, and our transport emissions have risen again by 2.7%. So it is an issue that that's quite intractable. What are our goals nationally? So that as part of the climate action plans, our goals are to have transport emissions by 2030 compared to 2018, and excluding international aviation. Aviation doesn't form part of our national inventory. So at a time when we're hoping to reduce emissions in transport, they're actually continuing to increase. The essential focus of the government's climate action plans is kind of really twofold if we break it down to two very simple approaches. One is efficiency, so increased efficiency of transport, of any kind of transport, whether it's by car or by bus or by heavy goods vehicle. And then the electrification of travel, because the belief is that if we electrify travel and we keep trying to decarbonise or remove the greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity, put more renewables onto the grid, that electrification is the way to go. But that in itself is not enough. We need a move to greater use of public transport and active travel. And of course, those have their challenges too, because of limited public transport and the challenges of active travel, such as cycling. But the first basically is insufficient without the second. The technical fix is not going to be enough to help us. When it comes to the arts sector and where those travel and transport emissions are by activity, production companies, obviously, so those would be dance, theatre, ballet, opera, transport and travel is really a key part of their impacts. Theatres and art centres much less so, because the key impacts there tend to be around building, energy, heating, electricity. Galleries and museums, for those that transport a lot of works, and a lot of galleries would have exhibitions that come from abroad and transport them abroad. There definitely are impacts there, but they also have big building energy impacts too. Festivals, definitely, that's going to be a key. We'll go into that in a little bit of detail, whether they're greenfield site or venue-based, such as the Dublin Theatre Festival. Resource organisations can be very different depending on the organisation, but some of them do a lot of work to support artists travelling here and abroad. Artist studios, the impacts there for travel would be pretty small. But basically, we would recommend that you begin by focusing on what you pay for, because you've got some control over that. We've mentioned that before, whether it's energy, whatever it is. Start with what you pay for, and then you can look at, for example, commuter travel and audience travel obviously was dealt with in the last webinar. And those are things that you can influence and in some cases support. And we just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of really good work being undertaken. We can't refer to all of that here, though Noreen is going to give you some interesting examples. But there is really good work being undertaken by a lot of arts organisations to address their travel impacts. And we're hoping that, that's something that you'll be able to share at a later date. And particularly festivals, I think, because they're so conscious of both audience travel and the business travel associated with what they do. So just looking at that maybe in a little bit more detail, if we look at theatres and art centres, and this is based maybe on the work that I did with the Greening Venues pilot project, working with some quite large venues and theatres, and really the travel and transport impacts for them are quite low. They will occasionally travel to visit festivals and other events abroad. They will travel a certain amount nationally. A lot of that would be by public transport. They may have artists in residence schemes where artists come from abroad or travel within the country to attend residencies. There's general business staff by the whole staff team, again, limited enough. And then networking. So, for example, attending conferences like the Performing Arts Conference and so on. Those are the kind of areas where, but it overall would be small in that particular area of theatres and arts centres. Resource organisations, it can vary a lot from one resource organisation to another, but quite a few resource organisations will support their members or artists either to travel to other countries or bring in artists and practitioners and curators from abroad. So that really varies from one organisation to another. And they do quite a bit of networking and business travel. Overall, most resource organisations have a really very small footprint, but these are just where the travel impacts would be. Galleries, really transporting artworks is the big issue for them, and also to some degree, curator travel. Artists will also travel for purposes of exhibitions, to attend other festivals and exhibitions abroad, and there's that general business travel and networking, and the same for artist studios who traditionally would not have a big, so it's really building energy where their big impacts are. Festivals, of course, are the big one really, because the Greenfield side festivals, because they bring in artists from outside of the country, particularly the big festivals, and they could be from all over the world. There's crew have to travel, suppliers and contractors have to travel to the site, and then festival programmers will often travel abroad to look at new work and source new work for the festival, and they network as well. And venue-based festivals, such as the Dublin Theatre Festival, would do a lot of would have similar areas of activity, particularly when it comes to the performers coming in. Dublin Dance Festival would be a good example, and festival programmers would travel to source new work and to network. And production companies, then, for them, this is probably the biggest area of impact. Touring cast and crew, but also transporting a set, tech, props and costumes. And some of that is international. For some production companies, particularly maybe dance and some theatre companies, international touring is a very important part and a very essential part to the essence of why they do what they do. And they also would do general business travel and networking. So we're just going to do a little bit of a deep dive into touring. And this really is based on a project that the Green Arts Initiative ran through Theatre Forum, as it was, Performing Arts Forum as it is now, in 2022 to 2023. And it was funded by the Arts Council. And we worked with 6 production companies and looked at 12 different touring productions. And we really were focusing on transport and travel and accommodation, which is something we're not going to go into in a great amount of detail today. So the project they concluded last year, and the overall emissions associated with that, which is kind of a figure that doesn't really mean much to us, but it was over 250 tons of CO2. About 100 tons of that was accommodation, but the rest of that was travel. So that varied hugely from one tour to another. So we weren't really comparing like with like, but we were getting some interesting insights. So you've got an international tour where you've got long haul flights with quite a big cast. You could have a short, small production touring nationally where the impacts are very low. So it varies enormously from one production to another. But I'm going to use this example, which I've used in an earlier webinar, but I think it does show the merits of why you want to measure your travel. And this is the example of a dance production company that used their travel data from this project to set a reduction target for emissions associated with travel. And so they were doing a national tour. They had 12 venues, 19 performers, quite a number of whom came in from abroad. And particularly with dance, international travel is really important because obviously dancers really need to be mobile, not only in order for us to bring them in to take part in performances here, but also Irish dancers need that access to perform abroad, because in order to sustain a career. So we're really, really mindful of that. There's 4 crew and a large set. And you can see the emissions in the chart there, but just interesting to see that, you know, almost 12 tons of that. So a large chunk of the impact from that tour was flights. The total impacts were 25 tons of CO2. Again, that sort of a figure that's very hard to kind of grasp. But what was of interest, and what was really a revelation to the company themselves, was that of the almost 12 tons of CO2 that were emitted because of the flights, almost 9 tons of that was 3 long-haul return flights. So having that information, having that better understanding of where the actual impacts were, allowed that company to make a decision about future tours and to set a cap. And this is something that other organizations could look at. You know, once you know, for example, that you have maybe an international, in terms of international flights, that your emissions are X, well, could you reduce them by 10%, or could you set a cap, say, for 10 tons for the next year? Even that is something to bring down the emissions from a year-on-year basis. This is a slight aside, but I just thought you might be interested to see how those 2 projects compared. You know, if you were to compare the Greening Venue Pilot project and the Greener Touring project, and obviously you're not comparing like with like, but it's interesting to see that, you know, a big international tour has had in this case, roughly 3 times the impacts, the emissions associated with it, as running a small venue for a year. So, you know, we tend to think of buildings and energy usage as being big, but it's just to show that the impacts of travel can also, and accommodation, because accommodation is a part of that, can be very significant as well. So just a word about air travel. And again, I'm so mindful of how important travel and mobility is to many people who are probably on the call today, because most arts organizations are very under-resourced, and many artists live very frugally and are great for taking public transport domestically, but just, I suppose, would be unrealistic to do this presentation without talking a little bit about air travel. And there's a very interesting website called staygrounded.org, which gives you a lot of really good insights into the impacts of air travel. And that's just a chart that kind of shows the difference between, you know, traveling by train. They use an example of Austria, where there would be good renewable energy mix, and, you know, looking at flights. And bearing in mind that traveling by car abroad is really not far off traveling by plane. It's not a great option either. Anyway, so those are just something to reflect on. More importantly, maybe from a climate justice point of view, and I think that's something, you know, we tend to be sometimes a little bit inward looking in Ireland, and sometimes a little bit inward looking in the arts sector, and just to broaden our horizons in terms of how many people actually fly. Only 1% of the world's population causes 50% of commercial aviation emissions. And those are definitely not coming from the arts sector we're talking about, but generally and globally, that's quite a stark fact. But more relevant maybe to climate justice is that more than 80% of the world's population have never set foot on an airplane. So while we consider it really crucial and important to what we do, we have to accept that there is an element of privilege to being able to fly. So looking at the possible solutions, these will be unique to every organization, because again, there's a sensitivity around international travel and travel. There are a lot of obstacles, which we're going to look at very briefly. Each organization it's not like, you know, what are the solutions to making your building more energy efficient? We can give you concrete guidelines, but when it comes to what you're going to do about your travel impacts, a lot of it is going to boil down to what decisions you make. Inform yourselves, and then decide based on the information that you gathered, based on the transport that you've measured. So we're going to look at some challenges and roadblocks, and really just to reiterate that all arts organizations will benefit from measuring their travel and transport and creating travel policy. And I say that knowing that many of you are already doing that. So we're very, that is very gratifying that is happening. So just again, looking at touring and what are the kind of solutions that even came out of the time that we spent working on that project. A lot of this is very commonsensical. You will know a lot of it already, but, you know, in terms of CAST, are there opportunities for increased use of public transport? That did crop up in the project that we did. Consider carpooling if that's not an option. support slow travel. There may be, if there's an international tour, there may be members of your cast or crew that are happy to try out slow travel. Increasingly, people will be looking at, electric vehicles and purchasing or hiring these. Obviously, that's a capital cost if you buy it. Work to identify the most efficient tour route, something that production companies really have been doing for years, but it's just worth saying here. And another slightly different slant on that is to maximize each location. So if you tour to a particular venue, maybe tour to less venues and maybe stay there for longer and make more use of it. So again, that has its downsides too, because it means that you're maybe not touring as extensively as you once did. So everything there's a compromise to everything. You can look at setting freight limits in terms of weight, using electric vehicles for shorter journeys, consider rail freight, and using shipping rather than transport by air. But the challenges that are there, they kind of crop up across the board. The poor public transport options, financial and budgetary implications, particularly for slow travel, longer lead-in time, the time it takes to slow travel, and the inconvenience to personal life. So I know we're suggesting solutions, but at the same time, we're conscious of what these obstacles and roadblocks might be in some instances. So transporting artworks, tour artworks by sea rather than air, it's also generally cheaper. Use zero or low emissions vehicles for local transport, and work to identify the most efficient tour route. And again, that's something that organizations are really doing, and possibly set freight limits. And again, there are similar challenges and obstacles in terms of lead-in time. It's not suitable for all artworks because some may be fragile and sea shipping might not be appropriate. More unpredictable journey times, and it may limit the scope of your exhibition if you're going to set limits to your freight. For festivals, again, just looking at that example of the dance company, you could look at setting, once you know what the emissions associated, what the distance associated with your travel were, could you set a cap on that? Which will just make you think and I suppose program in a very considered way with travel in mind. Support slow travel where possible. Eliminate domestic flights. So if somebody is traveling to Ireland internally, they shouldn't be taking a second flight, whether in their country of origin or here. Work with other festivals and venues to share work so that artists or companies are performing in a number of locations. And that is something that definitely happens already. Particularly festivals like Barbaro and so on, when they're bringing in work for children, will really try and share that with other venues across the country. Again, set freight limits, use electric vehicles, rail freight, and shipping rather than transport by air. And again, the challenges are broadly quite similar. Poor public transport options, budgetary implications, inconvenience, longer lead-in times, and so on. So those are challenges that, that will be in the back of your minds when you're thinking about what the solutions might be. And then just a general, those are the activities and organizations that will have the bigger travel impacts. When it comes to theatres and arts centres, resource organisations, artist studios, the travel impacts will be less of a consideration. But, you can still work with other artistic directors and programmers to share contacts for potential new work, so to avoid that duplication of travel. An interesting approach would be to consider bringing artists from parts of the world experiencing the worst of climate change, and that is across the board, so that rather than thinking about us and how we might travel and present our work to other parts of the world, maybe we can look at those parts of the world that are really suffering, that are on the front line of climate change, and consider bringing them to us if we're going to invest in travel. Set a limit to the annual amount of international air travel and consider slow travel methods for traveling to and from Western Europe, at least. There are options there. And again, the challenges are broadly similar, but I would add to that, there's the whole sense of less exposure to other cultural experiences if we're not allowing ourselves to travel as much abroad using air travel. Just thought it was worth referring to, again, anybody involved in the visual arts sector would be very aware of the Gallery Climate Coalition. And I just thought it was interesting to see how explicit they were about their what they see as being a crucial target, that in order to reach our CO2 targets, there needs to be a sector-wide reduction in overall volumes of shipping. So they're really explicit about that, even though they recognise the hurdles, and they're looking at some of the solutions that we've already mentioned. But interesting to see how specific they were about that, about air travel in particular. So just looking at where what we kind of see as the two important steps. Yeah, sorry, I should say we've got a Zoom poll for you here, just to see what you might be doing yourselves on travel, because I know many of you, you might not have a formal written down policy, but you do have an approach that you're taking. Some of you may have a travel policy. You may already be keeping a record of all business travel, so it may not be the case that you have a policy on how people travel, but you're recording it because obviously you have to expense that and so on. So all of that is just very useful to know. Okay, yeah, so it's quite a mixture, but yeah, but people have a good third have no policy, but an informal approach, which is great. And most people are keeping a record of business travel, whether to reimburse expenses or other. So that's great to know. So, see if I can move on. Yeah, so again, you've seen this before. This is the spreadsheet that's available on the Arts Council website that we put together. And one of the tabs on that is about travel. And we've updated it a bit recently. So it does allow for calculating the carbon emissions associated with each particular form of travel. So even if you don't want to use something as elaborate as this might seem a bit daunting. If you just have a simple spreadsheet that records the date, the who, the from where to where, possibly the why, the method of travel, that's enough to keep a sort of interim record. So at some point you can sit down and work out the distances and what the emissions are associated with that. But again, if that dance company we mentioned hadn't done this, they wouldn't have been in a position to set targets for reduction. So it's a really important way of grasping where the impacts are associated with travel. We'd also recommend that you look at a really short travel policy, because it just means that everybody's on the same page. You could include it as part of your environmental policy, but I would say like maybe 10 bullet points is enough to cover this. And that would include something like, a commitment to artist travel. So you could consider offering slow travel options. For example, we mentioned don't expense internal flights. For business travel, you could look at each journey instead of whether travel is actually necessary. And there's a very useful, the Gallery Climate Coalition have a climate conscious travel tree. Now they have quite an extensive travel policy that you could look at. But this is an interesting way of making a decision as to whether you would travel or not in the first place. Don't expense internal flights. Consider offering slow travel options. The key thing about having a policy is that means it's consistent, and you have a consistent approach to it. You could include something on staff commuting. It's not vital, but looking at flexible working, remote working, bike schemes, facilities for cyclists so that if they want to cycle, they can put their bicycle in a safe place, that they can shower and store the gear and so on. Again, only really suitable probably in urban locations, and in urban locations where there are safe routes for cycling, which is not in too many places. Audience travel we've covered obviously in the last webinar, but you might like to include it in your travel policy and provide information on sustainable travel options. Look at scheduling events, maybe at times convenient for public transport, and survey audiences. The key thing really is to involve your colleagues and other stakeholders in creating your travel policy. In other words, try not to make decisions that will affect people when you're not asking for their input, because you'll tend to meet resistance further along the way. You'll have missed something that they would have been able to fill you in on. So do include people in all of that. And I think I'm coming to nearly the end of my contribution now, but this is just an example of Creative Carbon Scotland's travel policy. They made it a bit visual just to make it easier to look at. And it covers local transport, increased video conferencing, public transport, cycling, UK and Europe by rail. Obviously, they've got much greater connectivity where they are in Scotland than we have here. Long haul flying, minimal taxi use. So just an interesting example to look at. And I think I'm just going to finish up on my part with these few kind of takeaways. And one is really that reducing greenhouse gas emissions with travel is complex, particularly for long journeys, for heavy goods, and travel to more isolated locations. But how organizations address their travel and transport impacts is very individual. So we don't want to be prescriptive about that. That's something that you're going to have to you decide for yourselves as an organization. But just do have that climate justice lens when you're making those decisions. Moving from transport fueled by fossil fuels to transport fueled by renewable energy won't be enough to reduce our travel impacts. So that technology fix by itself is not going to be enough. Frequent air travel has the biggest impact, and that's particularly long-haul flights. Recording travel associated with what you do should be your first step, and creating a short travel policy with buy-in from staff should be your second. And I think we might have another Zoom poll at this stage. I'm just going to stop sharing my...
Thank you, Katrina. And I will start sharing my screen. Yeah, we do have another poll. Has your organisation used any of the following methods to reduce travel and transport emissions? So let's take a look at that to see what your organisation has done to reduce travel and transport emissions. I can see the results coming in there now. So let's have a look. So 63% have slow travel nationally, followed by 55% promoted public transport and active travel for commuting. And then 50% availed of the Right to Work scheme. So we're still polling there. I'll give it another few seconds and we can make that public. But thank you very much, I suppose, for letting us know, what your organisation has been doing already. And, as Katrina said, like, we're aware that, so many of you are doing so much already, so it's, obviously we want to acknowledge that, which is very important. But I suppose just in terms of case studies, before I go into individual case studies, I just wanted to, I suppose, share with you, oh, apologies, I'm going back. Go forward. Some, I suppose, emissions calculations that we have done for organizations. So these are actual emissions that we have carried out over the past number of years. Now, there's a huge caveat to this data in terms of, we wouldn't have had all the data that we needed, and it was very much a work in progress in terms of organizations collating their information and getting better at it year on year. But just to kind of briefly walk through a couple of emissions calculations. This was for a resource organization in 2022. And you can see there, business travel and fleet travel were a huge part of their total emissions. Another example we took out was for an Irish theatre that we calculated emissions for. Again, the caveat here is that, we would not have had all of the data. Business travel was lower there. So you can see, the difference and Katrina, I suppose, was speaking about that earlier, that it is going to be so different for your organization type. And there is another example of a gallery, which interestingly enough, there is the freight travel is quite low, and the business travel is significantly higher. But again, I suppose it's just to make the point that once you start capturing your data, you get better in doing that year on year. So you're always, I suppose, qualifying this a little bit better every year. So it's just really to show you that it can vary across organizations. But I suppose on the topic of measuring our data, I did want to, I suppose, use West Cork Music as an example and thank them for allowing us to use them as a case study, because I think it's a great example of measuring impact and how to measure impact, and maybe just stick with it year on year and build frameworks around how you're capturing that data. And I suppose one of the great examples of that is through audience surveys. I think it's a great example of how to successfully use audience surveys to better understand travel and transport and how your audience are getting to your festivals. And in, I suppose, embedding sustainability questions in the surveys that you're sending to your audience. But just some key takeaways from audience surveys that West Cork Music have been doing. There's a growing awareness about their green policy. 78% across all three festivals used a car to attend events, and less than 20% across all three festivals used public transport to come to the festivals. So I suppose when you see, like, that's the data you can get back from using audience surveys, and that is such rich data. Like, it's so important to understand how your audience are coming to your festival. So I think that just, I suppose, illustrates the importance of being able to measure all of that, and how effective communicating with your audience can be on the topic of travel and transport. But another example, I suppose, on the right is international travel measurement, and this is for the Literary Festival. And I suppose just to see there how they were able to measure, year on year, their emissions from the Literary Festival when it came to international travel, and really identify how being able to see that in 2024, they had flew in more artists than in the past number of years, and you can really see the result there in terms of the increase with emissions. So I suppose just using this example to really show how important it is to measure our impact, and then you can start understanding your data And I suppose when you understand the data, you can really see in terms of the impact, and you can start breaking that down and start understanding that. And even from last year's emissions, they were able to measure that 68% was coming from emissions in 2023, but also to reflect that and to acknowledge that, you know, it is a very difficult area in particular, you know, because I suppose we have the challenge of public transport infrastructure in Ireland, and also the challenge that Katrina mentioned for touring musicians to make a living while using slow travel. So I suppose really those challenges that Katrina spoke about, how we can see these are directly impacting organisations in their attempt to reduce travel and transport emissions. But also in terms of taking actions, I think there's just really good example here of some of the actions you can take despite those challenges and obstacles. I suppose focusing on direct flights, so really encouraging an international audience or artists to take direct flights and to maybe to give them examples of this in terms of, you know, when you land in Dublin, you know, don't get a flight to Cork, but you know, take public transport. And maybe just start introducing the concept of taking direct flights and slow travel to artists, and really discussing that and communicating that with an international audience and artists. And again, looking at including sustainability questions in audience survey. And then the graph to the right, again, is another example of, I suppose, how measuring your impact and how the data tells a story. This is for Chamber Music Festival and their emissions trend. So I suppose Chamber Music Festival, they've always operated on a residency model. So typically artists must come for a minimum of 5 nights and participate in multiple events. And this model significantly reduces the amount of transport emissions for both international and local transport. But there's a story there to be told. From 2022 to 2023, more artists took, I suppose, transfer flights, but then following on, you know, communications and working with artists between 2023 and 2024, artists were taking more direct flights. And you can see there that, you know, that helped in terms of emissions reduction. So there is a story being told there in terms of the data and understanding that. And I suppose once you can understand that, you know, you can put actions in place. And that's very clear in terms of, you know, working with artists and trying to encourage more direct flights to Ireland rather than, you know, taking multiple transfer flights, and starting with it and working with what you can. But I suppose just like, I suppose a summary in terms of the findings and the thoughts from West Cork Music and reflecting on their green policy. And I think Katrina has been, I suppose, speaking to this as well, that, you know, there is the acknowledgement that, you know, we need travel and transport. It's an integral part of the arts and culture sector. And I suppose an interesting point there that, you know, audiences are not yet fully back, you know, especially international audience. So there is a reluctance to put any obstacles in their way. And I suppose the best angle, as with musicians, is to encourage longer stays, to make up for that carbon footprint, and really the importance of communication and publicising local links and bus schedules from Cork for day visitors. I suppose it's acknowledging that slow travel from Europe to locations like West Cork is arduous. And I suppose reflecting on the fact that, for example, the port in Dublin, there is no public transport link to Houston, you know, so you still have to use a car. So that's, you know, those are the challenges that festivals are facing. But a comment as well on regarding artist travel, you know, we're just implementing what St. Magda's Festival initiated 20 years ago. So that's another resource for us to look at. And again, that peer-to-peer learning and what are other festivals or organisations doing. It is proving hard to wean musicians and their agents from cramming in as many gigs in as many festivals and concert halls as possible. And maybe, you know, that's a legacy from the pandemic as well. And I suppose the challenge of slow travel, you know, it is costly, you know, it's taking longer, and it's difficult to expect artists to incorporate that into their schedule. But a question that was posed, which I think is an interesting one for us today, is whether sectoral quotas need eventually be enforced. So I suppose in terms of that once we know our footprint, then, you know, do we need to look at a sectoral quota? But that was just, I suppose, a question that would be posed. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that. But really, and I suppose, you know, we're kind of going back to, we're working with what we have. And, you know, there's huge challenges around the infrastructural deficits and the public transportation links in Ireland. So we certainly want to acknowledge that. But I think it's a wonderful case study of, you know, acknowledging the challenges you face, but then measuring your data and seeing what you can do with that data. So we greatly appreciated being able to use that as a case study. We're also delighted to be able to feature Galway International Arts Festival. I suppose when you look at the festival's sustainability policy, you can see that they highlight establishing partnerships that will help us achieve our goals, support and help us to reduce impact on the environment. And I think what they did this year was a great example of a partnership. And really this was focusing on travel and transport, communicating with their audience to plan their festival attendance with sustainability in mind, you know, asking national attendees to take a bus or a train or to share a ride to Galway. And then for international attendees, again, to be conscious of what flights they were taking and to make use of flights that emit a lower carbon footprint. And again, that notion of direct flights versus multiple flights, and for locals to, you know, promote active travel and public transportation. But it was their partnership with Bus Éireann in terms of really having that, I suppose, push and to have a huge campaign to promote public transport and active travel as part of the festival this year. And it was really, I suppose, that communications piece, and also looking at bus scheduling and operating late night buses according to event times, and looking at the festival and in partnership with Bus Éireann to say, okay, can you extend your schedule? Can you work around our event times? So I think that is a great example of working with partners and overcoming the challenges that we face when it comes to travel and transport. We've spoken a lot about slow travel, and I just wanted, I suppose, to mention this example. We have two great examples of slow travel. You've probably heard of Slow-Mo, Rita Marcalo's Slow-Mo. It was a choreography as a traveling gift, a series of embodied traveling postcards. And this is a beautiful example of Slow-Mo. The project it started in Ireland. It traversed through Ireland via Europe. It went through countries such as Cyprus, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, and the UK by train and ferry. So this was Irish-based Instant Dissidents and their Slow-Mo project. So I suppose instead of being a finished show that tours, Slow-Mo turned the slow travel itself into the very framework for creating the work. So at each city they passed through, the company opened a letter previously sent to them in Ireland by a resident of the city they were traveling to. And the letter told a story of that person's connection to the city. And then following on from that, you know, a piece of work and dance was created. So as they traveled through these cities and countries, I suppose opening letters by residents, they were, I suppose, creating a journey, and the audience were traveling with them. So I just thought it was a wonderful concept. But the final presentation then was an amalgamation of all the dances that had been created during the journey. And I suppose all of the stories from the letters being created, and that was presented to the audience. And I suppose the audiences were traveling the company's journey with them. And then what was lovely was that this year, Instant Dissidents reversed the process, and artists from Slovenia and France created dances as they slow travelled to Ireland, and that was based on letters sent to them by Irish residents. So I suppose just really, I suppose that fresh concept in terms of, you know, how do you travel slowly, but how do you create your program around that? So I think that was a lovely example. But another really nice example of slow touring was the Vagabonds Slow Barge Tour, and that was in 2021, and that was a series of concerts across August and September, and it was called the Floating Tour, and it was along the River Barrow, the Royal and Grand Canal, and it was a series of concerts where the group were joined by fellow musicians, and I thought it was just very informal and just such a lovely concept that you would take your time and over, I suppose, a span of a number of weeks, travel around on a barge and hosting concerts and meeting people. And it was described by the band as an exercise in slow touring, rejecting the planes, trains, and automobiles for a slow-moving barge, as well as getting to know about the history, folklore, and song of some of Ireland's lesser heralded gems. So I think it's a great example of travel and transport and slow touring, but also that connection to heritage and just, I suppose, what they gained from that is just a lovely example. And then the next example I'm going to go to Scotland for. So this is probably an example of unintended consequences. The Glasgow effect that you might have heard of. It was a controversial durational performance that the artist Ellie Harrison undertook in 2016. So I suppose it was based on the very simple premise that she would refuse to travel beyond Glasgow's city limits or use any vehicles except her bike for the whole calendar year. So she had lived in the city for 7 years at that point. She had toured the UK and internationally. And I suppose the project then was to be a real life experiment in terms of thinking globally and acting locally. She would, slash her carbon footprint. But I suppose the controversy was around the fact that she'd been granted a fund of £15,000 to do it. And many people felt that that was quite controversial because so many people were in a situation where, financially they couldn't leave Glasgow. So, what was wrong with having to stay in Glasgow for a year? And I suppose because of the title of the project as well, the Glasgow effect, that title was borrowed from the field of population health to describe the then unknown reason why Glasgow has 30% higher excess mortality than very similar post-industrial cities such as Manchester and Liverpool. So I suppose the unintended consequences of what she was trying to do, it did draw some controversy. But I suppose, what she was trying to do was kind of make connections between the social, environmental, and economic problems facing that city, and also to experiment how, she could still produce work by not traveling and remaining in Glasgow. But I think there's some very interesting commentary and articles around that whole project, and I suppose how that was perceived by the local population in Glasgow and the arts and culture sector. So I thought I would include that as a case study example as well. And then another example from Manchester, and this is an example of a sustainable travel policy. And I suppose this kind of touches on a lot of what Katrina was saying earlier. I suppose it's working with what you have, and some organizations are very lucky that they're in places where they can promote active travel and public transport. But I suppose Home, which is the Arts Centre, Cinema and Theatre Complex in Manchester, it is city centre location. They do benefit from having great bicycle routes, and they're ideally located to be reached by public transport and cycling and on foot. But I suppose they have done a lot themselves. So they definitely encourage staff to cycle to work. They have locker rooms and showers. They offer bike maintenance and training workshops to really support staff in doing that. They have a bike pool on site, so even if you get the train to work and you have a meeting, you can take a bike from the bike pool. So I thought they're doing a lot themselves, even though they are in the advantageous position of being connected by public transport and bike routes. They work a lot with Manchester City. You can see on the right the transport and travel hierarchy that Manchester City Council would use and provides to all their staff. And that's very much, I suppose, adopted by Home also. They partner with Corridor Manchester, a sustainable travel group, Transport for Greater Manchester, and are part of Greater Manchester's Clean Air ambitions. And they've won a number of awards. So I suppose it's just, acknowledging what an organisation can do themselves, even though, they might be very well connected with public transport and bike connections. They would also have, I suppose, similar to what we saw earlier, like a do's and a don'ts in terms of the digital communications. They would host a lot of their meetings online, and then if they do need to travel, they have that, I suppose, again, question, do you need to travel? If so, can you take the train? And of course, yes, they're connected by train. They can take the train to Europe. You know, they do, it's a very different transport link that they have. But again, they would have those questions to ask staff in terms of making decisions on transport. And then I suppose finally, I just kind of wanted to I suppose elaborate on the Stay Grounded organization that Katrina referenced earlier. This is a really interesting network. It is more than 200 member organizations. So they would make up climate justice groups, NGOs and trade unions. It's a very interesting website to visit, and they have a really interesting case study on Schiphol Airport in terms of capping flights at the airport, and I suppose the advocacy they have done on that. But I suppose it's really their work and their campaigns are rooted in highlighting our need to reduce aviation and to really question you know, airport expansion and supporting initiatives that promote alternatives to flying. And they have a 13-step, I suppose, policy to transform transport society and the economy to be just and environmentally sound. So they're just some case studies, but also I suppose you know, just some interesting websites to take a look at as well, just to expand on the topics that we've mentioned throughout the webinar. And then, as always, we will share our resources with you in terms of the toolkits and I suppose guides, and those will be the practical guides. Julie's Bicycle Travel and Transport resources have a number of practical guides we'll share with you. And again, these will be mentioned throughout the webinar. There's some data collection templates, and we have the Excel that we looked at earlier as well. The Gallery Climate Coalition, which we mentioned, this is the climate conscious travel policy and guidelines. It's a very interesting policy and guidance to take a look at. It really is, in terms of an example. And then Creative Carbon Scotland. So this is again a guide to measuring your travel. And just, I suppose, in terms of getting started with measuring, tools to understand travel data as well, but we will include all of those. So I suppose, again, just to remind you of where all of the previous sessions and recordings and slides and resources are saved, and then taking a look at where we are for next week. So we'll have content, programming and communications, but I will stop sharing now to allow time for questions.